The Gambler's Wager by Weston Ford. A gentle breeze swept through the bustling streets of New Orleans as James Montgomery adjusted his silk cravat, his weathered fingers betraying the countless hours spent shuffling cards. The year was 1847, and the city pulsed with the rhythm of steamboats, merchant calls, and the ever-present lure of fortune. James had earned his reputation as one of the most skilled poker players along the Mississippi River circuit. His green eyes, flecked with gold, missed nothing at the card table, yet they had failed to notice Miss Eleanor Bradford until she swept into the Magnolia Club that fateful evening in her deep burgundy dress. Eleanor was no ordinary Southern belle. The daughter of a prominent shipping merchant who had passed away the previous year, she now managed the family's extensive business interests with an acumen that surprised and unsettled many of her male contemporaries. Her auburn hair and intelligent brown eyes spoke of both beauty and determination, a combination that stopped James dead in his tracks as she approached his table. "I believe there's room for one more player," she said, her voice carrying the refined accent of Charleston society, though tempered by years of conducting business in New Orleans. The other players, a cotton broker, a riverboat captain, and two wealthy planters, shifted uncomfortably. James found himself straightening in his chair, something he hadn't done since his days in Boston society, before he'd chosen the uncertain path of professional gambling. "The stakes are considerable, miss?" James let the question hang in the air. "Bradford. Eleanor Bradford. And I'm quite aware of the stakes, Mr. Montgomery. Your reputation precedes you." She pulled out a chair and sat with practiced grace, placing a substantial purse on the table. "I believe this should cover my buy-in." What followed was the most remarkable game James had played in his 15 years of professional gambling. Eleanor not only understood the intricacies of poker but played with a strategic brilliance that both impressed and unsettled him. She won as often as she lost, showing neither elation in victory nor disappointment in defeat. As the evening wore on, James found himself watching her hands, elegant yet strong, adorned with a single emerald ring that caught the lamplight. He noticed how she would tilt her head slightly when contemplating a difficult decision, how the corner of her mouth would quirk up almost imperceptibly when she held a strong hand. "You seem distracted, Mr. Montgomery," she observed during a particularly tense hand, her eyes meeting his with a knowing glance. "Most unusual for a man of your professional focus." James felt the unfamiliar warmth of embarrassment color his cheeks. "Perhaps the company this evening is unusually diverting," he replied, laying down his cards to reveal a winning hand. Eleanor's laugh was genuine, musical. "Well played, sir. Though I suspect you've shown me only the smallest part of your repertoire." The other players gradually drifted away as the night deepened, leaving James and Eleanor to continue their delicate dance of cards and conversation. They discussed literature, music, and the changing face of New Orleans society. James found himself sharing stories of his years at Harvard before his family's financial collapse had forced him to seek alternative means of support. "You speak of it without bitterness," Eleanor observed, shuffling the deck with surprising skill. "Life deals us the hands it chooses," James replied. "The art lies in playing them well, regardless of the cards we're given. An interesting philosophy for a man who makes his living from games of chance." "Is that disapproval I hear, Miss Bradford?" Eleanor dealt the cards with precision. "Merely observation, Mr. Montgomery. Though I wonder if you've ever considered applying your considerable talents to more conventional pursuits." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Eleanor's companion, Mrs. Whitmore, a stern-faced widow who clearly disapproved of the entire situation. Eleanor rose gracefully, gathering her winnings. "I've enjoyed our game, Mr. Montgomery. Perhaps we shall meet again." They did meet again, frequently over the next few weeks. Sometimes at the Magnolia Club, sometimes at social gatherings where James's wit and charm had earned him grudging acceptance, despite his profession. Each encounter deepened their connection, though both maintained a careful distance dictated by the social conventions of their time. Their careful dance of propriety and attraction might have continued indefinitely had it not been for the arrival of Thomas Blackwood, a notorious gambler from Mississippi with a reputation for ruthlessness both at and away from the card table. Blackwood had a particular interest in Eleanor's shipping business and made no secret of his intention to acquire it, through marriage if possible, through other means if necessary. James watched with growing concern as Blackwood pressed his suit, appearing at social functions where Eleanor was present, attempting to ingratiate himself with her business associates. The man's reputation was well known in gambling circles. He was not above using marked cards or weighted dice when opportunity permitted. One evening at the Magnolia Club, Blackwood confronted James directly. "You're becoming an impediment, Montgomery," he said quietly, his cold eyes fixed on James's face. "Miss Bradford requires a man of substance, not a mere card player." "Miss Bradford seems quite capable of determining her own requirements," James replied evenly, though his hand tightened on his glass. Blackwood smiled thinly. "Perhaps a game to settle the matter? Winner steps aside, loser leaves New Orleans permanently. Unless you lack the courage to risk everything on a single hand." James knew it was foolish, knew Blackwood would certainly attempt to cheat, but the challenge had been made publicly. To refuse would destroy his reputation and possibly endanger Eleanor's business interests even further. "Name your game, Mr. Blackwood." The word spread quickly through New Orleans society. The game was scheduled for the following evening at the Magnolia Club. The stakes, everything. James spent the day putting his affairs in order, knowing that win or lose, his life would change dramatically after this night. Eleanor found him in the club's library hours before the scheduled game. "This is madness," she said without preamble. "You cannot trust him." "I know." "Then why?" James turned to face her, allowing himself for the first time to fully acknowledge the depth of his feelings. "Because some things are worth risking everything for." Eleanor stepped closer, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "There are other ways to handle Blackwood. My business connections would be compromised by any obvious intervention," James finished gently. "This way is cleaner. Besides," he smiled, "I have an advantage he doesn't suspect." "And what is that?" "I have something genuine to play for." The game that evening drew a considerable crowd. Blackwood arrived with his usual entourage of sycophants, while James sat alone at the table, calm and focused. The game was 5-card stud, a single hand to determine everything. James had spent years learning to read the subtle tells of other players, the small changes in expression, the slight tremors of hands. But more importantly, he had learned to track cards, to notice the nearly invisible marks that dishonest players use to gain advantage. The hand progressed slowly. Each card dealt with deliberate ceremony. James noticed the nearly invisible markings on the cards Blackwood had supplied, but instead of exposing the cheat immediately, he played on, allowing Blackwood to believe his scheme was working. The final card was dealt. Blackwood's smile was triumphant as he laid down his hand, 4 kings, a nearly unbeatable hand. The crowd murmured, some already turning away, assuming the game was over. James sat quietly for a moment, then spoke clearly. "An impressive hand, Mr. Blackwood, particularly given that the deck should only contain 4 kings while I've been counting 5. The color drained from Blackwood's face as James calmly exposed the marked cards. The evidence was irrefutable, and in the world of professional gamblers, such proof of cheating was a death sentence to one's reputation. Within a week, Blackwood had left New Orleans, his reputation in tatters. James, however, faced a different challenge. His exposure of Blackwood's cheating had earned him respect among the city's elite, but it had also forced him to confront the hollowness of his own existence. Eleanor found him packing in his room above the Magnolia Club. "You're leaving?" she asked from the doorway. "It's time for a change," he replied, not turning to face her. "I'm considering an offer to manage some shipping interests in New York." "How convenient. I happen to be expanding my business to New York as well." Now he did turn, hope warring with uncertainty on his face. Eleanor smiled, crossing the room to stand before him. "Life deals us the hands it chooses," she said softly, echoing his words from their first meeting. "But sometimes, Mr. Montgomery, we're allowed to reshuffle the deck." James took her hand, feeling the warmth of it against his palm. And what would society say about a respectable businesswoman joining forces with a reformed gambler? "Society can hold its breath," Eleanor replied, stepping closer. "I've always preferred to play by my own rules." Their marriage 3 months later was a small affair, attended by a select group who had witnessed their unusual courtship. They built their shipping empire together, though it was said that on quiet evenings, they could still be found engaged in private games of poker, playing not for money or advantage, but for the simple pleasure of matching wits with a worthy opponent. James kept a deck of cards on his desk in their New York office, not for gambling, but as a reminder that sometimes the greatest wins in life come not from the hands we're dealt, but from knowing when to change the game entirely.